Yeah, I don't know what happened this week. No. Life goes on. Okay, today's shir is sponsored L'Zeichen Nishmas Eliezer ben Chaim Levi Zal Sham Shev and Aliyah. Okay, I want to talk about. We're going to continue talking about shaving, like we were doing, about shaving in Chol Hamoed. But I want to talk about the tshuva of the Besamim Rosh and what that has to do with shaving in Chol Hamoed, and the Besamim Rosh in general. So, let me start. I want to start with this. I want to start with a letter from the Stipler. The Stipler. I don't know if the Elam heard of the Besamim Rosh, didn't hear the Besamim Rosh, so we'll start from the beginning of the story. The Stipler in Kraina de Igrisa, in Chelik Aleph, Siman Pei Aleph, he has as follows. The Stipler says, Lanias Daiti, he says, Le'nachin klal, lefarsim kloino shel ha'mechaber Besamim Rosh mikama taimim. He says it's not the right thing to talk about the negative of the mechaber of the Besamim Rosh for 4 reasons, he says. Aleph, mipnei kvoid avaisav, out of their hearts to his fathers. Now the Besamim Rosh, as we'll discuss, his father was a Gadol Hadar. That's Aleph. Beis, he says, when the Stipler's writing this, it's 150 years after the P'tir of the Besamim Rosh. He says, Ulai, he already has a tikkun, and there's no reason to talk about it anymore. That's Tam number 2. Tam number 3, he says, there's also embarrassment for some Gedolim. Even so, they made a mistake. Some Gedolim made a mistake. And number 4, he says, is Kama Anashim gave Yavi Rifyun b'tztayer lahem she'echad me'osin shayim migdolei Torah niskalklu dekfir rachman aslan Hashem yirachim. Also, could cause other people to come to the Rifyun if they think that someone who was like a Gadol Hadar or from the Gedolim, did the wrong thing. Now it says Yechelum l'sader maimer b'chlal oidas ha'askala harura she'chrivi yadas Ashkenaz v'taytziyasel ha'im rachman aslan. You could write about the haskala that destroyed German Jewry and the bitter outcomes that it had. Gam l'shar medinas b'lila haskir shemus mechach ma'aterish nukdu rachman aslan b'shusa. This is the Stipler's letter. So now I don't know if we could adhere mamish to the Stipler's hadrach over here, but let's at least keep it in mind that most of the people that we're talking about today are Gedolim or sons of Gedolim or relatives of Gedolim. Most of the people here were very much from the elite, Rabbanim's group in Europe at the time, and we'll talk about the yeses and the nos and each shita with a lot of derech eretz and very carefully. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, the reason why this is relevant to our shmuz is as follows. We spoke last week about the Neiv Yehuda. The Neiv Yehuda's heter to shave in Chol Hamoed. The Neiv Yehuda said that as long as you shaved before Yom Tif and you have a payil ani, a poor worker doing the shaving on Chol Hamoed, so it's not a problem because it's not a malacha that's aser, and there's no chashash for Shem Yikanos Yom Tif Kishum Novel. We're not afraid you're going to come into Yom Tif, disgust him because you already shaved there of Yom Tif. That was the basic premise. He based it on Rabbeinu Tam, where it's brought down in certain Rishonim that Rabbeinu Tam held like this. Others strongly argued on him, and we went through some of the back and the forth of the people who argued him and what they said. Now the Besamim Rosh is as follows. The Besamim Rosh is a sefer that was put out in 1793 by Reb Shaul Berlin. Now Reb Shaul Berlin is the son of Reb Tzvi Hersh Levin, who, if you remember last week, one of the Bali Plukta with the Neiv Yehuda was Reb Tzvi Hersh Levin. Now his son is Reb Shaul Berlin. Reb Tzvi Hersh Levin was the Rav of Berlin. He was a Gadol Hadar. He was a real Gadol B'Torah. His son Reb Shaul Berlin, who was equally talented in learning, put out a sefer called Besamim Rosh. Now Besamim Rosh, what it presents to be is 392 tshuvas, heim laharash, v'lashar gedei l'rishanim zacharim l'vracha. What it presents to be is a tshuva sefer that has 392 tshuvas that were written by the Rosh and other bnei deirei of the Rosh. Now the Rosh died 500 years before the sefer was put out. So what it is a collection of old tshuvas that were found that he said was put together, compiled originally by someone named Reb Yitzchak Dimevalina, who was a contemporary of the Beis Yosef from that dar, and he compiled these tshuvas, and now Reb Shaul Berlin found them again during his travels in Italy, and he's republishing these 392 tshuvas from the different gedolim of his dar. Now this is actually a first edition. This is from 1793, this one. It's easier to read than the new one, because since it became such a contested point, it was never really republished. There's not a newer edition of the Besamim Rosh. The last time the Besamim Rosh was published was in 1793. When it was republished, it was recently, a few times, by someone named Reb Reuven Amar, who's what you would call a Besamim Rosh truther. Like he's from the last few today who strongly believe that it's actually Tshuvas HaRosh, every single one of them. He wrote Haggayis, and he republished it, but he republished it just like a photocopy of it. So it's just been deteriorating, over time. But this is the republished by what you would call a B'Sam Reish truther. Now, the B'Sam Reish in Tshuva Mem, and I'm going to talk about the whole back of the B'Sam Reish in a second, but what it has to do with us is as follows. The B'Sam Reish in Tshuva Mem says as follows. It's a little short Tshuva that is being presented like the Rosh is writing. He says as follows. The Shaila was about a person who shaved his head on Chol Hamoed, al smach shekvar gilach me'erev Yom Tov. Al smach that he was already shaven Erev Yom Tov, al pi hanishma b'shem Rabbeinu Tam zal shetiru. And this person was being samech on what he heard that Rabbeinu Tam was makel on this. It says hadin imcha. Now, the one who's writing the tshuva to the Rosh over here, you have to halt cup over here, was a Rav, who's someone in his kehila shaved on Chol Hamoed, attempting to be samech on Rabbeinu Tam, and the Rav was furious at this person and put him in cherem. Now the Rav writes a Shaila to the Rosh and asks him, did I do good? Did I do right? So says the Rosh, he says, Hadin imcha she'ein noigin kula ki yachad makam rabim. You are correct that we're not saying on this Rabbeinu Tam, yachad makam rabim. She'Rabbeinu Meshulam, v'chein Rabbeinu Toiv mivina, v'chein Rabbeinu Mishparia chalku olav. Because there's a whole packle of Rishonim that are chelik on him. The haboim acharei mechach me'aderis. But he says, v'haboim acharei mechach me'aderis, lo yimutza'onu b'shekasa v'yihira lo heter, lahedya heter b'davar. We never found someone who was lahedya mekel about it. So Mela, you can't be saimach on it. Amnam, he says, lo yisamer hilchasa uminig b'davar. It was never get paskint. Now keep in mind, this is officially being dated to before the Shulchan Aruch is written. This tshuva is being written in the 1300s, before the Shulchan Aruch. It says, we never found like a psak one way or the other. V'raya brura l'nimtzas lesser. There's no clear raya to argue in a tam. V'layafa sisa shenadisa isay. You didn't have to put him in chayrim. That was an overreaction. Achar shasakir in a tamzal. V'lishri le'mar niduyav. So now what this does is a very, very creative way of, without arguing, without, Kilu saying that we paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, you pull out a few of the strands that make it, such a das yachin. I mean, by the time the Rebbe Yehuda is writing about it, Rabbeinu Tam is mamash some favor for the shita that exists. Rav David Tzimtzum even suggests Rabbeinu Tam never held like that halacha l'maisa, right? It's like this far out shita that we're not really bound by, that no one really holds like. And then Memela, like, come on, how could you come yachad makam rab, make a cool like this? It's crazy. So what he does over here, what this tshuva does is extremely destabilizing. What it does is like, okay, everybody, like the Rosh is writing, there's a Bakanter Rabbeinu Tam, there was some, and the names that he lists are not anybody that's as a consequential to argue Rabbeinu Tam. There were other Rishonim B'Shaita who argued on him. Lematzinu, like a grace of Hechra one way or the other. So Mela, don't be Saimach on it, of course don't be Saimach on it, but to put him in Chayrim, you're not there. So what this does is very creatively upturns the apple cart. The Neder Yehuda was published in 1777. All the fighting that happens about it in a couple of years. Then in 1793, this new find comes, a tshuva from the Rosh, and it destabilizes the whole hierarchy gets destabilized by a tshuva like this. Now comes along the Kasad Harsana. Now Kasad Harsana is Reb Shaul Berlin's contribution to the Sefer. Reb Shaul Berlin, who was a Goyin Olam, a Talmid Chacham Muflig, his contribution to the B'Sam Reish was he wrote Kasad Harsana, which is like extras, Haras, Hasagis, filling in the blanks, because the Rosh's tshuvas over here are very short, so filling in the blanks with whatever's going on. Now the Kasad Harsana steps in, and he says, he draws the obvious conclusion that would come from this tshuva. He says, Midiver Rabbeinu Nira, the Layam Rinon, the Mayad Halachik Divrei Amekel, Yachad Neged Rabim, with Loik Halach Mishnah, etc., etc. Fine, we don't, Midiver Rabbeinu looks like we don't paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, he says, fine. Then he brings the whole shmooze of, he says as follows, he says, Herachim ze, al divrei Shnei Avis Yisrael B'deirenu. Two Heintige, what a coincidence, two Heintige Gedei Olam from Ardar who wrote about this. Kvoid She'eri, my relative, Hagoyin B'Sefer Neder B'Yehuda. The Kvoid Abba Mari, Hagoyin Neiroi, Ashabah V'Chakru. What a coincidence that this exact discussion was discussed by Arichas between my cousin the Neder B'Yehuda and my father, Reb Tzvi Eresh Berlin. By Arichas, he says. Hine Chuvasei Asher Kasav, my father's tshuva al davar nitfas b'shem b'sefer binyan Ariel shechiber kvei doidi hagoyin me Amsterdam, which we saw quoted in the Neder B'Yehuda. My uncle, the Givat Shalom from Amsterdam, wrote a sefer. And this is the Binyan Ariel. I'm sorry, not the Givat Shalom, I'm confusing him. The Binyan Ariel wrote a sefer, and in it he has a tshuva from my father. He says, okay, Amram kitzru bay, v'shanu midaitai, v'ayidei kenitnu makam l'kam diktukim. He says, and now I'm going to go in, and he brings the different stadim, he brings the Rambam, he brings the Neder B'Yehuda's raid, whatever it is. And to the end of it here, he has a very good pshara to thread the needle between not arguing with his father and yet agreeing with the Neder B'Yehuda based on this tshuva. He says as follows. He says at the end, what I think the pshara he says is that giluach harosh, shaving the head on Chol Hamoed, getting a haircut. My father said very good. No one ever had a havmina to get a haircut on Chol Hamoed. beyond the pale. Like my father said, that's Neskabel and Gansen, you can't do that, he says. You need a big vad of Chacham to be makel for that. He says, but this tshuva that the Rosh, the Rabbeinu HaRosh, Mikdash Gdei Rishonim Zal, fine, okay. It wasn't Neskabel yet. But when it comes to shaving a beard, where there the minig wasn't as well established because no one really shaved their beards, back in the day. It's a relatively new phenomenon to shave the beard. Over there in L'chayru, you see from the Rosh that it wasn't settled halacha, not like every Tam, and there's makom to be makel to shave your beard in Chol Hamoed. So he draws the obvious conclusion of what would come out of this tshuva. The 8 lines of the Rosh, and the obvious conclusion of destabilizing the halacha psuka and agreeing with the Neit Yehuda is what the conclusion is. That's what the Kasda Asana. Now, to kilu the untrained eye, meaning to us, this would seem like a pretty, innocuous one that he's doing. But, meaning of all the things that we'll go through, that some Reish has that are controversial, that are considered to be, outside the lines of normative halachic discussion, and that got him in a lot of trouble, this one, Chach, is the Neit Yehuda. Chach, you have the Gadol Adar writing about it in his Chuvas and sticking with it all the way. So, Meken Shemeinin, this is not, Kvira, this is the Neit Yehuda. It's the same like the Neit Yehuda. But of all the things that got him in trouble, this was the one that got him in trouble first. And for obvious reasons. He used the circle, his close circle of people where he operated was under his father's sphere of influence. So he got major pushback to this piece in Kasa Harsana. And right away people started, how could you argue on your father? Your father's a long tshuva, where he's machmer, how could you say lakula? And right away, within a month of the Sefer being published, in 1793, before the Sefer even was widely dispersed in the whole world, he puts something called the Maidar Rabbah, which was put in some of the Svarim. I don't think it's in this one, but it was put in some of the Svarim, but I have it here, a photocopy of it. And in the Maidar Rabbah, he writes as follows: Le'ein ha'kaira b'sefer Kasad Harsana Siman Mem. To one who's going to look at what I wrote in the Kasad Harsana and Siman Mem, he says, Shekasavti daiti the bizakin yesh lahater gilach kedem amayid kadas benetam, that by beards there's makom to be makel to shave them on Chol Hamoed if you shave them already before Yom Tov. Hine hayezeh b'chashvi ki yitzasi ladim b'davar chadash. That I was donning in like a new thing, in a tshuva from the Rosh. I was just saying what would come out of it. Beis amdi b'perikahu le'nisanani hazman latzia dvara l'fnei kvoid adayni avi meri agayni riyar. When I was writing this Kasad Harsana, I didn't have the time to show it to my father. Ki etzach alay malacha. Apoilim deichkim. Okay, I was very busy. I didn't have the time. Ukashiyira harayad leisalkaloi hagaka hagen. And when I saw that my father was not, fully satisfied with this Haggadah that I made over here, so, fine. Mamela, he also was aimed on this chilek, v'lei hiviyim, fine, me'ata, afshi yeshi madi lachzik divrei dvari b'hachta desaf. Even though I have what to say, to be machzik what I wrote in the Kasad Harsana, lahavi oid simuchim, leikar achilek, ve'yosadea, I have more to bring rayas. Still, achar shekvar amdu, Adayni ala chilik ve'inoyach loy haridaiti b'teila negadaiti harama. So now he doubles back and he says, my father told me that he's not happy with what I did over here. And Hagam, and it's like mixed messages. Hagam, I could stand up for what I said and explain it and make it make sense. But Lamaisa, my father said not to, so out of cover for my father, I'm going to pull it back. Afilu hu mekel v'ani machmer, kavachemer shu machmer, v'le'ekroid shmi ala kula hazais, afilu l'snif ba'alma. Don't bring my name in regards to this Indian anymore, even as a sniff. So the one that got like the first pullback, the first immediate pushback on some Reish was this tshuva about shaving the beard in Chol Hamoed, which was because his father, Tzvi Ashbelin, was strongly opposed to it. His uncle, the Binyan Ariel, and his father, Tzvi Ashbelin, were very against it. So he pulled this one back. Now, this didn't do anything to move the needle. Now, this is just the reason why I'm talking about the Sam Reish is because of this tshuva. Now, let's talk about the Sam Reish for real now. So, the Sam Reish comes out. The Sam Reish of Shal Berlin was, by the time the Sam Reish was published, was a shtickle known entity. And I'll tell you why. The Rav of Altona, of Ahu, Altona, Hamburg, and Weisbach, whatever, I think maybe pronounced that wrong, the 3 great German Kehilas, was at that time Rebbe Fall of Hamburg. Rebbe Fall HaKohen Hamburger, who was considered from the Gedolei Hadar, and was a tremendous leichem against the innovations of the Haskalah and the Reform and the Conservative. And he put out a sefer called Teres Yikusil. That was the name of his sefer. Now, Teres Yikusil was a regular halacha sefer, meaning a regular, sefer as a Rav would put out. Now, in 4 years before the Sam Reish came out, in 1789, I think it's 1789, a sefer was published anonymously in Hamburg called Mitzvah Yaxel. Now, Mitzvah Yaxel was an anonymous sefer. It was published under a pseudonym, a name that no one knew who it was. And what it does was attack the Teres Yekusiel of the Rav of Hamburg, of the Rav of Altoona, from head to toe, from Kappas Fis. He went after the sefer Teres Yekusiel, and although it was written b'derech, a rabbinic dispute, meaning it was written as a halacha sefer, but the elbows were very, very sharp, and there was a lot of flagrant fouls. You know what I'm saying? It was a very, very sharp worded sefer, and it worked. The Olam and Altona got worked up like crazy, and there was a lot of pushback. And eventually, people found out that the mechaber of the sefer Mitzvah Yaxel was none other than Rav Shaul Berlin. Rav Shaul Berlin, who for whatever reason didn't like Rav Rafal HaKohen, put out the sefer Mitzvah Yaxel. He put to work his prodigious Talmud Chacham abilities, and he went after Rav Rafal Hamburger in a very, very serious and harsh way. Now, the community, the Kehillah, was up in arms. They wanted to throw him out, to chase him away. They were afraid of him. And he writes about it, and his father writes about it in different places, that he finds himself being, near there from Ala Zaytin. The Olam was very, very upset at him. If not that his father was Rav Tzvi Berlin, who was from the Gedolei Hadar in Germany, he probably would have been put on Chayrim and banished, and you never would have heard from him again. Being that his father was from the Gedolei Hadar, his father, was able to backstop the pushback, and he lives to fight another day. With a blot, with a blot on his record, because people are very upset at him, and we'll see that this blot comes back to haunt him. He got a mark on his record, but he lives to fight another day because his father's the Gadol Hadar of Tzvi Shlavin. Now, several years later, he comes to the B'Sam Reish. Now, in the Akdamah to B'Sam Reish, he writes that during a tkufa in his life, after he gave up his stellar in Frankfurt to Uder, not the other Frankfurt, the other Frankfurt, where he was a Rav, there was an Av Bezner, he gave up a shtel, he traveled extensively through Italy, and in Italy he came across this Tachrich Ksavim, where he found Ksavim of the Arzarua and Ksavim of the Rosh. Two different notebooks of Ksavim that were unpublished, and he brought them back with him, and these Ksavim of the Rosh, which were originally edited by Ritzlik Divalina, he's now going to edit and put out the Kosta Harsana, and even in the Hakdama to B'Sam Reish, he makes note of the fact that not everything seems to shtim with the Rush in Chidushei Rush, in Piskei Rush, or in Chota Rush. So he suggests that could be some of them are from contemporaries of the Rush, Talmidim or Chaverim. So it's not really a stira, it's within the Beis Medrash, within the sphere of influence of the Rush. So he's going to put this out. Now, right when he puts this out, the alarm gets sounded. The first one, I think, to sound the alarm was Wolf Hindenheim. I think it's called, the sefer called Zev Yitroif, which I didn't bring anything because this is one very old print and I couldn't read much from it. But the Wolf Hindenheim is from the first ones. But then the one who really bears the axe to grind is none other than Rav Rafal of Hamburg's Mechutin. Rav Rafal of Hamburg was making chasana then, making a shidduch with Rav Yaakov Ettinger, not the Aruch LaNer. Rav Yaakov of Etting, he was the Rav in Etting guy. I don't know if he put it on his Svarim. He was a Mechutin with Rav Rafal HaKohen, and he was traveling on his way to the chasana. They were going to meet in Hamburg. And on his way, he stops in Altona, which is right near Hamburg. It's part of the same, group of kehillas. He stops in Altona, and his host presents him. Did you see this beautiful new sefer that came out? It's called B'Samim Reish. It's a collection of the Rosh's Shuvas that were never published. He takes one look at it. He sniffs it. Absolutely not. He just takes one sniff. He says, no way. Not real. Not true. Not the Rosh. Not Rav Shaul Berlin. Nothing. There's nothing here to talk about. He takes one sniff and he holds his puzzle. Now, he doesn't just sit on his hands and say it's puzzle. He starts dispatching letters. And of them, some of them survive, some of them don't survive. He sends a letter to the first one, I think the first letter that he sends is to Reb Meshulam Igra, I think, actually. He sends a letter to Reb Meshulam Igra. He sends a letter to Reb Mordechai Banet. He sends a letter to others. To his group, Reb Mordechai Banet was a Talmud of his. He sends a letter to them, strongly decrying the what he found in the B'Sam Reish. And he compiles a collection. His letter that he sends to Reb Meshulam Igra has 13 psakim that he finds extremely questionable in B'Sam Reish. I'll just read you a few of them. He says, Aleph, he says, is Kasav B'Shem Rosh, the Balkari B'Kiri Vasal Niach Tefillin. He brings a psak from the Rosh that the Balkari is not allowed to wear tefillin. And then we never see it. That's not the halacha is not so. He says, he writes, B'Shleisha Taniyas Ein Tzarech Tzeitzak Rechavim Dai B'Shkiyas Achama. 3 of the fast, the less chamer that fast, you don't have to wait for Tzeitzak Rechavim, Shkiyah is enough. Halacha is not like that. He says, Shemutel Eis HaTzarech Lasses Chasana B'Tisha B'Av. V'Achasim V'Kalav Ha'Sheshbinim V'Chalakarim Lechel P'tur Milasanas B'Tisha B'Av Atzmai. Not the halacha is not so. And number 4 he brings, Hitter Oid B'Shem Rosh Hagvinim V'Achalav Shechal V'Goyim The Hayed Mishem Rosh, Rabbeinu Tam Amr Sharoy Lahoishiv Eid Gedol Lahater Sienam. Rabbeinu Tam wanted to be Mata Yayin Nesach. Now that's a half truth. That's based on a Taisvus. Rabbeinu Tam is a Kula by Yayin Nesach, and Chalavakum it's all mutter. Hituk Samim Abasar Isha. Again, Shaloika Halach. The Halach is not like that. He brings 13, examples. Now he, incidentally, maybe in a tactical manner, chooses to go with purely halachic disputes of the B'sam Reish. Meaning, when the Maram Banet compiles his list, I think his list is longer. When the Maram Banet starts writing Chuvas, when Ramatcha Banet starts writing Chuvas, and one of them we have in this newly republished Prashas Mordechai, which is the Maram Banet's Chuvas, in Chuvah Hey is one of his Chuvas. He compiles, I think, 19 critiques of the B'sam Reish, and some of them are more like hashkafic and up-to-date, modernity, things that the modern world wanted to enhance or change in Judaism, that the B'sam Reish was adding support to, that he also, more like Chacham Seifadik, hashkafa, like more Hungarian. I would say more Hungarian, less German, more Hungarian, is some of the things that the Maram Banet includes. But Rabbi Yaakov Katzenellenbogen, I think his name is, Rabbi Yaakov Ettinger Katzenellenbogen, he's writing purely halachic, and he brings 13, points. He sends it to Rishon Migra. He sends it to the Maram Banet. Now the Maram Banet, I don't think we have Rishon Migra's letter back, but Rishon Migra is kilu nimna amongst those who held that it was not the Rosh, that this was a fraud. It was not the Rosh. But the Maram Banet, and we have his tshuva back. He writes that I don't have the tshuva in front of me. It never made it to Hungary, to where I am. If you could hasten to send me a copy of the B'sam Reish with the Kasad Arsana, I will gladly go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and I'll already see everything that's in there. Which eventually he does, and the Maram Banet Taka publishes Chuvas, strongly contesting the B'sam Reish and saying that it's a fraud, it's not the Rosh, can't be the Rosh, and he has many, harsh points of critique on the Chuvas, on the Chuvah of the B'sam Reish. Now, the Maram Banet decides to write to Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, to the father of Shaul Berlin. He goes straight home. He says to Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, what's going on over here? Your son's putting out a sefer, it can't be the Rosh, look at all these tainas, X, Y, and Z, and it can't be. And now here again is Rav Shaul Berlin gets the backstop of his father's status. His father is a Gadol Hador, and that affords him a tremendous amount of status. And Rav Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, the father of Rav Shaul Berlin, writes a small kuntras, which is called, the kuntras is called Ish Anav. It's like a small rhyme. It starts with a small rhyme, Ish Anav, Liyip Lupanav. It's a small rhyme. It's a very nice little tshuva, 3 pages, where Rav Tzvi Hirsch Berlin is made that this sefer, the B'sam Reish, that his son, Rav Shaul Berlin, is publishing, was in my house for years already, maybe possibly decades. Yad Adam. Nobody tampered with it. It's been how it is in my house. It's, ever since he came home from his travels in Italy, he came home with the Tachrach Kisveyadis, some of the Rosh, some of the Azruah. Nobody's touched it. It's been in my house the whole time. And, people have a bone to pick with my son, are just, picking a bone with my son, and there's nothing wrong with it. And Tzvi Hirsch Berlin gives it its full support. Now that's point number 1 that's worth referencing. And Ad Kedei Kach, that in the Hakdama to B'sam Reish, in the first edition, it has a haskama from Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, from the father, who says in no uncertain terms that, he says, the Rosh doesn't need my haskama. It's the Rosh. It's the Rosh's tshuva. The Rosh needs no haskama from me. And it's a nice little tshuva. He says, my son is a Talmud Chacham, who's a Tmuchi Gavri, a Tmuchi Kmeya, and his Kasad Harsana can be relied upon. He knows how to learn. He knows what he's saying. And the Rosh is the Rosh, and that's all. Now, that's all fine and good. But what Reb Shaul Berlin managed to acquire, which was maybe possibly even more valuable than that, was he managed to acquire Haskama from the Ned Yehuda. Now, the Ned Yehuda, you have to keep in mind, in 1793, was on his deathbed. Ned Yehuda probably did not write this letter. That's not to say that he didn't dictate the letter and didn't agree with the letter being written, but he probably never wrote this letter. The Ned Yehuda was very ill at the time already. His son, Reb Shmuel Landau, who later becomes the Ab Bezdin of Prague, once the Ned Yehuda dies, was the actual mechaber of this letter. We know this because we have letters from Reb Shaul Berlin. Very interesting. When Reb Shaul Berlin wrote to the Ned Yehuda's house to get Haskama, so Reb Shmuel Landau writes back, my father is mamish, almita, he can't do anything, but he told me that he's maskim. If you found ksavim from the Rosh and you have what to say, so matay put them out, it's amazing. And he sends it back, signed from Reb Shmuel Landau. And Reb Shaul Berlin writes him back, could you ask your father if he would give me reshus to sign the letter in his name, so that it doesn't leave open the idea that this is not from the Ned Yehuda. And when he doesn't get a response, he writes a letter 4 weeks later. It's timely, it's important, it's pressing. Would it be okay if I change this to make it more firsthand? And he gets permission from the Beis HaNed Yehuda to do that. So now this is a letter that comes from the base on Nadi Yehuda, but it's hard to know exactly. Nadi Yehuda was sick. Now I'm not saying that Nadi Yehuda didn't agree with what's said here. The Nadi Yehuda Pashas did agree with what's said here, and believed that Reb Shaul Berlin, the Nadi Yehuda was very close with his father, Tzvi Arsh Berlin, and believed that this was, if he said he found Chuvas in the Rush, he found Chuvas in the Rush and he put them out. Maybe there's a short Chuva, where again he says very similar that the Rush does not need my Haskama. Chuvas in the Rush need no Haskama from anybody. And Reb Shaul Berlin himself is a Talmid Chacham, he knows it right, and Matayv Manam, it should be with a lot of success. That's what he puts out. Now, Reb Shaul Berlin did manage to find a pretty good shield over here. Like Yehuda and Tzvi Arsh Berlin is no joke. Meaning, even if you have Reb Shalom Migra and you have Ram Benet and you have Rakim Katzenellenberg and you have people writing chuvas against him, but you have the Yehuda and Tzvi Arsh Berlin, it lends a tremendous amount of gravitas to the product he's putting out, and because of that, the Besamim Rosh was never really put out of business. Besamim Rosh always lingers in this twilight zone, this gray zone between authentic and inauthentic. Meaning, if you ask a professor of books in Bar Ilan University, not a question, it's a fraud. No shayla, it's a fraud. Pashut, it's a fraud. They never found any Ksav Yadis for it. There's no corresponding documents in any libraries in Europe. Of course, it's a fraud, no shayla, no question. If you ask even Shalom Migra and the Ram Benet and the Chassam Sefer probably and others, fraud. You ask the Minchas Elazar, it's a fraud. Many Gedolim. But mitzad sheni, you have Gedolim like for example, you may have heard of this one, like Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who quotes him 25 times. Throughout his various farm, Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes the Besamim Rosh. Now, he never quotes him as the Rush. He never gives him the, if one had found the Ksav Yad of the Rush, that's a conversation ender. That's a showstopper. If you have a debate going on between the Chassam Sefer and the Shagas Aryeh, and then someone presents, oops, I have a Rush, that's a game stopper. That's a checkmate. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger never uses it as a checkmate. So clearly he doesn't give it the status of Kisvei Rush, but at the same time he feels there's a lot of value, there's a lot in there that he likes, that he quotes, and Nadi Yehuda quotes from him extensively. And Nadi Yehuda is not the only one. I believe Lamashal, I'll read you a short list of the people who quote him, with some sort of mixed chashivas. Reb Shlomo Eiger, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the Pischei Tshuva, the Ben Ish Chai, the Marsham. Others quote him, similarly, the Beis Ephraim, the Beis Meir, the Shalom Meishav, the Maratz Chias, David Sinsheim. He's quoted by many of the Gedolei Hadar. Now, all with varying levels of trust or distrust, meaning nobody believes that these are all untouched, unvarnished chuvas from the Rush from hundreds of years ago. Everybody realizes that these are either touched by Miksasam or touched by Kulam or totally fake, somewhere in the middle. But Heyois, it's very Talmid Chacham-dik, and it's written with a lot of Kishrin and Seichel. Many of the Gedolim did quote from him, sometimes as a smach, sometimes as an addition. So because of the Haskama from the Nadi Yehuda and of Tzvi Arsh Berlin, the Sefer lingers in this gray area where it's hard to know exactly how to treat it. So it's not the Rush, but it's also not the Rush, somewhere in the middle. Now, the Chassam Sefer in a Tshuva and Arachaim and Kuf Samach Daled, in the first edition of the Chassam Sefer calls them Kasav Bekizvei Harash with a Zayin. Chaf Zayin Veiz Yud. Kizvei, not Kisvei. Kizvei Harash. Now, there were those who felt like Matzio Shrashin wrote in a piece on this, and Mastamat Tzatay Sefer, and they have to fix it. And I think today, if you take a Chassam Sefer and Arachaim, it's not there anymore. Today it says Kisvei Harash, which is itself, a step down from Matzasi in the Rush itself, Kisvei Harash. But the Chassam Sefer Pashta says Kizvei with a Zayin on purpose. The Chassam Sefer didn't do that by mistake. And there's many other Chuvas. The Chassam Sefer uses the word Ziyuf attached. It was like in a Chuva where he strongly argues in Hilchos Avelis, he says Bezen is Dayif Chuvas Harash. The Chassam Sefer certainly on team Maram Benet and Mishal Migra and whatever that held that it was completely a ziyaf, a total fraud, a total fake. Now, I don't think anyone today could have any more of a hechra. I mean, this Reuven Amar has hasagas here from Ravad Yosef and his own chuvas, and Ravad Yosef has an interesting middle ground. Ravad Yosef writes that he says, look at the dvarim. What's his words? He says. I forgot his words. Ravad Yosef writes, look at the words, not at the writer. If the words are good, we like the words, we don't have to do the writer. So this lingers. It lingers in some sort of, middle of gray area. And it had a big impact on the machlekes that we were donning about shaving. Now, I think we're done with shaving for now. After Shavuos, I want to continue. We'll move maybe to here, up here, instead of here, down here. And maybe we'll talk about Naziris Bizman Hazeh, which is itself an interesting sugya. All right, Zagazan.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.